The dust turned crimson under Mara Dawson's boots as she walked past the last weathered building of Chico, California, carrying nothing but a canvas satchel and enough anger to fuel her all the way to Sacramento. It was June of 1878, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dirt road ahead, but she didn't slow her pace, didn't look back at the town that had taken everything from her except her pride and her determination to survive. She had made it perhaps half a mile when she heard the horse behind her, the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth. Mara kept walking, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the Sacramento Valley stretched out in waves of golden grass. She knew that sound, had heard it often enough in the 3 months since she'd arrived in Chico with her aunt, seeking a fresh start after her parents had died of fever back in Missouri. "Miss Dawson," came the voice, deep and familiar, tinged with something that might have been concern or might have been reproach. "Where exactly do you think you're heading?" Mara didn't stop, didn't turn. "Away from here. That's all that matters." The horse came alongside her, matching her pace with an easy walk. Jacob Remington sat astride the chestnut mare, his hat tilted low against the sun, his shirt dusty from whatever work he'd been doing before he'd apparently decided to follow her. He was the foreman at the Double Creek Ranch just outside town, a man of 26 years who had earned his position through hard work and a reputation for fairness that was rare in these parts. "Sacramento's 40 miles north," he said, his voice level. "You planning to walk the whole way in this heat with one canteen?" "I'll manage." "Like you managed last time?" That made her stop. Mara turned to face him, her green eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You had no right to interfere then, and you have no right now." Jacob eased himself down from the saddle with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and blue eyes that seemed to see more than most people wanted to reveal. There was a scar along his jawline, a memento from a cattle drive gone wrong 2 years back, and his hands bore the calluses of constant work. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I'm not about to let you walk out of town alone. Not again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. 3 weeks ago, Mara had tried this same thing, had made it 6 miles before the combination of heat and exhaustion had nearly killed her. Jacob had found her collapsed by the roadside, delirious and sun-sick, and had carried her back to town, despite her weak protests. She'd woken up in Doc Morrison's office, angry and embarrassed, and more trapped than ever. "My aunt is getting married," Mara said, her voice tight, "to Herbert Finch. In 2 weeks they'll be moving to his ranch in Redding, and there's no room for me there. He made that very clear. So, you're running." "I'm leaving with dignity while I still can." She started walking again, her spine straight despite the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. "I have a friend in Sacramento. She works at a hotel there, said she could get me a position as a chambermaid. It's honest work, and it's a chance to start over." Jacob led his horse beside her, the reins loose in his hand. "Did you write to her? Confirm the position's still available?" Mara's silence was answer enough. "Thought so." He didn't sound smug, just resigned. "Mara, I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but walking 40 miles in June heat without proper preparation is suicide, and I think you know that." "Then what would you have me do?" She stopped again, wheeling on him with sudden fury. "Stay here and watch my aunt marry that pompous fool? Sleep in the street once they leave? Beg for work at the saloon?" Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured. "Come work at the Double Creek." "What?" "We need help at the ranch house. The boss's wife, Catherine Remington, she's been looking for someone to help with the cooking and the housework. Her sister used to help, but she got married last month and moved to San Francisco. It's good work, fair pay, and there's a small cabin on the property you could live in." Mara stared at him, suspicious. "Catherine Remington? Any relation to you?" "My brother's wife. Thomas owns the ranch. I'm just the foreman." He met her gaze steadily. "It's a legitimate offer, Mara. No strings, no expectations beyond honest work, and it would keep you close enough to visit your aunt before she leaves." The offer was tempting, dangerously so, but Mara had learned the hard way not to trust easy solutions. "Why would you do this? You barely know me." "I know you've had a rough time of it since you came west. I know your aunt's been struggling to make ends meet, and that Finch is the kind of man who sees people as assets or liabilities, nothing in between." Jacob's expression softened slightly. "And I know what it's like to feel like you've got no choices left. My parents died when I was 19. Thomas was already working the ranch, barely keeping it afloat after a bad year. If he hadn't given me a place and a purpose, I don't know where I'd be now." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her anger because it was easier than accepting help, easier than admitting she was scared and desperate. But the sun was brutal, and her canteen was already half empty, and the thought of 40 miles of nothing but road and hope was beginning to feel less like freedom and more like folly. "I won't take charity," she said finally. "Good, because I'm not offering it. Catherine really does need help, and she's particular about who she hires. You'd be earning your keep." He paused. "But I'd need to take you back to town first, so you can talk to her proper, meet the family. Then, if everyone agrees, we can get you settled at the ranch." It wasn't the escape Mara had envisioned. It wasn't the clean break, the dramatic departure that would prove to everyone in Chico that she didn't need them, didn't need anyone. But as she stood there in the dusty road with the sun burning the back of her neck and her future as uncertain as the heat shimmer on the horizon, she realized that maybe survival mattered more than pride. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll talk to her. But if this is some kind of trick, it's not." Jacob's voice was firm, almost gentle. "I give you my word." Mara nodded, still wary but too tired to maintain her defensive stance. Jacob gestured to his horse. "You can ride. It's too hot to walk back." "I can walk." "Mara." He said her name with a hint of exasperation. "Let me help. Please." There was something in his tone that broke through her resistance, something that suggested he understood exactly how much it cost her to accept even this small kindness. She approached the horse, letting Jacob help her into the saddle before he swung up behind her. His arms came around her to hold the reins, and Mara tried to ignore the sudden awareness of his presence, the solid warmth of him at her back. They rode in silence for the first mile, the horse moving at an easy pace that ate up the distance. Mara found herself relaxing despite her determination to stay guarded, the gentle rhythm of the ride and the exhaustion of the past few weeks catching up with her all at once. "How did you know I left?" she asked finally. "Mrs. Chen at the general store saw you walking out of town. She sent her son to the ranch because she figured someone ought to know." Jacob's voice rumbled close to her ear. "She worries about you. She barely knows me. People in small towns worry about everyone. It's the blessing and the curse of places like Chico." There was a hint of amusement in his words. "You get used to it after a while. I'm not planning to stay long enough to get used to anything." Jacob didn't respond to that, and Mara wondered if he believed her or if he'd simply decided not to argue. They passed the marker that indicated 5 miles to Chico, and Mara felt something twist in her chest, the familiar combination of failure and reluctant relief. She'd tried to leave, and once again, Jacob Remington had brought her back. "Why do you care?" The question emerged before she could stop it. "You don't owe me anything. We've barely spoken more than a dozen words before today." Jacob was quiet for so long that Mara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "When I found you 3 weeks ago, you were barely conscious, but you were still fighting. Even delirious, you were trying to keep walking." He paused. "I've seen a lot of people give up out here. The West has a way of breaking folks who aren't built for hardship. But you're not broken, Mara. You're just cornered. And I guess I figured if I could help you find a way out that didn't involve dying on the side of the road, it was worth the effort." The words settled into Mara's chest, uncomfortable and warming all at once. She wasn't used to people seeing her as anything other than a burden or an obligation. Her aunt loved her, in her way. But there had always been an edge of resentment to it, a sense that taking in her orphaned niece had been a duty rather than a choice. And Herbert Finch had made it clear from the start that Mara was an inconvenience he had no intention of tolerating. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it. She felt rather than saw Jacob's nod. "Don't thank me yet. Catherine's a kind woman, but she's got high standards. You'll have to win her over yourself." They reached the outskirts of Chico as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with businesses that served the surrounding ranches and farms. There was a general store, a saloon, a bank, a church, and a handful of other establishments that gave Chico the feeling of a community trying to establish itself in the midst of vast, indifferent wilderness. Jacob guided the horse past the town center, heading west toward the open land where the Double Creek Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of prime California territory. The ride took another 20 minutes, and by the time they reached the ranch gates, the air had begun to cool, bringing relief from the oppressive heat. The ranch itself was more impressive than Mara had expected. The main house was a sprawling 2-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Behind it stood a barn, several outbuildings, corrals, and what looked like bunkhouses for the ranch hands. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and the whole operation had an air of prosperity and careful management. Jacob helped Mara down from the horse, then handed the reins to a young man who'd emerged from the barn. "Thanks, Charlie. Give her some extra oats. She's had a long afternoon." "Sure thing, boss." Charlie tipped his hat to Mara with a friendly grin before leading the horse away. Jacob gestured toward the main house. "Come on. Thomas and Catherine should be inside." Mara followed him up the porch steps, her nervousness returning in full force. This was her last chance, really. If Catherine Remington didn't want to hire her, she'd be back where she started, with no options and no future beyond whatever desperate measures she could cobble together. Jacob knocked once before opening the door and stepping into a spacious entryway that opened into a large living area. The house was well furnished but practical, with none of the fussy ornamentation that some wealthy families favored. Everything spoke of comfort and use rather than display. "Thomas, Catherine," Jacob called out. "Jacob?" "In the kitchen," came a woman's voice, warm and slightly harried. They found Catherine Remington in a large, well-equipped kitchen, up to her elbows in flour as she worked dough on a wooden counter. She was a woman in her late 20s, with blonde hair pinned up in a practical bun and blue eyes that radiated intelligence and good humor. She looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from concentration to curiosity. "Jacob, I didn't expect you back until—" She noticed Mara and stopped, her gaze sharpening with interest. "Hello, I don't believe we've met. Catherine, this is Mara Dawson. Mara, my sister-in-law, Catherine Remington." Catherine wiped her hands on her apron and came forward with a friendly smile. "It's lovely to meet you, Miss Dawson, though I must admit I'm curious about the circumstances." Jacob launched into an explanation, giving a concise but honest account of finding Mara walking out of town and his offer of employment. As he spoke, Mara watched Catherine's face, trying to gauge her reaction. The other woman listened attentively, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. When Jacob finished, Catherine turned her full attention to Mara. "So, you're living with your aunt, and her upcoming marriage has left you in a difficult position." "Yes, madam," Mara said, fighting the urge to fidget under that steady gaze. "I don't mean to sound pitiable. I'm willing to work hard, and I learn quickly. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. My mother taught me before she passed." "I'm sure she did." Catherine's tone was kind. "But what I want to know is why you were walking to Sacramento instead of looking for work here in town." Mara hesitated, then decided honesty was her only real option. "Because everyone in Chico knows I'm dependent on my aunt's charity, and I'm tired of being seen as someone to pity or dismiss. I thought a fresh start somewhere no one knew my history might give me a better chance." Catherine nodded slowly. "That's a fair answer, and truthful, which I appreciate." She glanced at Jacob, then back to Mara. "I do need help, and Jacob's right that the position is legitimate, but I should be clear about what it involves. The work is demanding. I need someone who can help with cooking for the family and the ranch hands, keeping the house clean, tending the vegetable garden, and generally managing all the tasks that come with running a household this size. The hours are long, especially during busy seasons. In exchange, I offer fair wages, room and board in the guest cabin, and Sundays off, except in emergencies." "I can do all that," Mara said firmly. "I believe you can, but I also need to know you're planning to stay for a while. I can't afford to train someone only to have them leave after a few weeks." Catherine's gaze was direct, but not unkind. "Sacramento will still be there in 6 months or a year if you decide that's where you want to be. But if you come work for me, I need your commitment that you'll give this a real try." It was a reasonable request, and Mara knew it. She took a breath, considering the offer from all angles, looking for the trap or the catch. But Catherine's expression remained open and honest, and Jacob stood quietly to the side, his presence somehow reassuring. "All right," Mara said. "I'll give you 6 months, and if it's not working out for either of us, we can part ways with no hard feelings." Catherine's smile widened. 6 months is a good start. Now, let me show you the cabin, and we can discuss when you'd like to begin." The guest cabin was a short walk from the main house, nestled among a grove of oak trees that provided shade and privacy. It was small but well built, with a single main room that served as living space and bedroom, a tiny separate kitchen area, and even a washroom, which Mara considered a luxury. The furniture was simple but sturdy, and there was a stone fireplace for cold nights. "It's not much," Catherine said, "but it's private and comfortable. My sister loved staying here." "It's wonderful," Mara said honestly, already imagining what it would be like to have a space that was truly her own. They discussed details as they walked back to the main house. Mara would start in 3 days, giving her time to pack her belongings and say goodbye to her aunt. Catherine outlined the daily routine, the expectations, and the household rules with the same straightforward efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. By the time they finished, Mara felt both excited and slightly overwhelmed by the prospect of her new life. Thomas Remington arrived as they were concluding their discussion, a tall man with the same dark hair as his brother, but broader through the shoulders, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He greeted Mara with polite warmth, clearly trusting his wife's judgment about the hiring decision. "Jacob will take you back to town," Catherine said as they prepared to leave. "But I'm looking forward to working with you, Miss Dawson. I think this is going to work out well for both of us." The ride back to Chico was different from the earlier journey. Mara rode in front again, but this time there was less tension, less fear. Jacob seemed content with silence, and Mara found herself processing everything that had happened, the strange twist of fate that had turned her desperate escape attempt into an unexpected opportunity. "Thank you," she said as they reached the edge of town, "for interfering. Again." Jacob's quiet laugh rumbled against her back. "You're welcome, though I suspect you'll curse me for it at least once or twice when Catherine has you scrubbing floors at dawn. Better than dying in the desert. That's the spirit." There was warmth in his voice, a hint of approval that made Mara's chest feel oddly tight. He rode her right to her aunt's small house on the south side of town, helping her down with the same careful courtesy he'd shown all afternoon. As Mara's feet touched the ground, she looked up at him, trying to put into words the complicated gratitude and confusion she felt. "Why did you really do this?" she asked. "The truth." Jacob met her gaze, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "Because the first time I saw you in town, you were helping Mrs. Chen carry supplies when her cart broke. You didn't know her, had no reason to stop, but you did anyway. And then I heard how you'd been sitting with old Mr. Patterson when he was sick, reading to him even though he couldn't pay you for your time." He paused. "You're the kind of person who deserves a chance, Mara. That's why." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and turned the horse, riding back toward the ranch with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. Mara watched him go, her heart beating a little faster than the situation warranted, her mind turning over his words like precious stones she wasn't quite sure what to do with. Inside, her aunt was setting the table for supper, her thin face lighting up with relief when Mara walked through the door. "Oh, thank goodness! I was so worried when I heard you'd left." "I'm sorry, Aunt Sarah." Mara set down her satchel and moved to help with the meal preparations. "But I have good news. I've found a position at the Double Creek Ranch. I'll be starting in 3 days." Her aunt's relief was palpable, mixed with what looked like genuine happiness. "That's wonderful, dear. The Remington family has an excellent reputation. You'll be in good hands there." They spent the evening discussing the details, and for the first time in weeks, the tension between them eased into something approaching their old relationship. Sarah admitted that she'd been sick with worry about what would happen to Mara, that Herbert's refusal to include her in their household plans had been a source of bitter arguments. Knowing Mara would be safe and employed lifted a weight from her shoulders that had been visible in every line of her face. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Mara packed her few belongings, visited Mrs. Chen to thank her for her concern, and even managed a civil conversation with Herbert Finch, who seemed relieved to have the problem of his future niece-in-law resolved so neatly. She helped her aunt with wedding preparations, the two of them finding a closeness they had lost somewhere in the stress and uncertainty of recent weeks. On the morning Mara was to start at the ranch, Jacob arrived with a wagon to transport her belongings. He helped load her trunk and bags with efficient ease, chatting comfortably with Sarah about the weather and the upcoming wedding. Mara watched him interact with her aunt, noting how he put the older woman at ease, how his natural courtesy seemed entirely genuine rather than performed. The goodbye with Sarah was tearful but hopeful. They promised to write, to visit when possible, and Mara found herself genuinely happy for her aunt, despite the circumstances. Sarah deserved stability and companionship, even if Herbert wasn't the man Mara would have chosen for her. The ride to the ranch felt different now that Mara was arriving as an employee rather than a potential one. Jacob kept up a steady stream of information about the ranch operations, the family, and the various people she'd be working with. He was a good storyteller, making even mundane details interesting, and Mara found herself laughing at his description of the ranch hand's latest attempt to break a particularly stubborn horse. Catherine met them at the cabin, helping Mara get settled with the same efficient kindness she'd shown during their first meeting. She walked Mara through the daily routine in detail, showed her where everything was kept in the main house, and introduced her to the cook, a gruff older man named Pete, who worked out of a separate kitchen near the bunkhouses for the ranch hands' meals. "You'll be handling the family's meals and the main house," Catherine explained. "Pete manages the crew. He's particular about his domain, so it's best not to interfere unless he asks for help." The work began immediately, and Mara threw herself into it with determined focus. She cooked breakfast for Thomas, Catherine, and Jacob, who apparently took his meals at the main house. She cleaned, organized, tended the garden, and handled a dozen other tasks that Catherine assigned with patient instruction. It was exhausting work, but it was also satisfying in a way Mara hadn't expected. There was something deeply gratifying about seeing immediate results from her efforts, about knowing she was earning her place rather than accepting charity. Jacob was a constant presence those first few days, though Mara gradually realized he was deliberately making himself available in case she had questions or needed help. He showed her where things were stored, explained the rhythms of ranch life, and generally made himself useful without being intrusive. Mara appreciated it more than she wanted to admit, though she was careful not to rely on him too heavily. A week into her employment, Mara was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Catherine came in with a troubled expression. "I just received word that my mother's taken ill in San Francisco. I need to go to her, probably for at least 2 weeks." "Of course," Mara said immediately. "Don't worry about things here. I can manage." Catherine smiled, but worry still creased her brow. "I know you can, but I'm afraid it means you'll be on your own sooner than I'd planned. Thomas will be out with the men most days, and Jacob's got his own responsibilities. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask either of them." "I'll be fine," Mara assured her, more confident than she felt. Catherine left the next morning, and suddenly Mara found herself in charge of the household. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, a test of everything she'd learned and her ability to handle responsibility. She threw herself into the work with fierce determination, rising before dawn to start breakfast, and often working until well after dark to ensure everything was done to her standards. Jacob noticed, of course. He started appearing at odd times, checking in with casual questions that Mara eventually realized were his way of making sure she wasn't drowning. She found his presence both reassuring and slightly irritating, unused to having someone pay such close attention to her well-being. "You don't have to hover," she told him one evening, as he helped her carry water from the well to fill the kitchen cistern. "I'm perfectly capable of managing on my own." "Never said you weren't." Jacob hoisted another bucket with easy strength. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered," says the man who probably never needs help with anything. He laughed at that. "You think I got to be foreman at 26 by being too proud to learn from people who knew more than me? I spent years asking questions and taking advice from anyone willing to give it." Mara paused, considering him in the fading light. He looked tired, she realized, with dust coating his clothes and a weariness around his eyes that spoke of long days in the saddle. "What made you want to be a foreman? Why not strike out on your own, start your own ranch?" "Maybe someday," Jacob said, his tone thoughtful. "But Thomas gave me a home when I needed one. Helping him build this place into something successful feels more important than chasing my own ambitions right now." He glanced at her. Family's important. Blood or chosen, doesn't much matter which. The words struck a chord in Mara's heart, echoing thoughts she'd had, but never quite articulated. I suppose that's why you're so determined to help every stray who crosses your path. Is that what you think you are? A stray? Jacob's voice held a note of something that might have been hurt or disappointment. Mara set down her bucket, suddenly aware that they had ventured into territory more personal than she'd intended. I don't know what I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life changed when my parents died. Coming west was supposed to be a fresh start, but it's been nothing but struggle and uncertainty. Fresh starts are rarely clean, Jacob said quietly. They're messy and hard, and full of moments where you question whether you made the right choice. But that doesn't mean they're not worth it. Is that what you tell yourself on bad days? Every single time. He smiled, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made Mara's breath catch slightly. And then, I get up the next morning and try again, because that's all any of us can do. They finished filling the cistern in companionable silence, and as Jacob left to tend to evening chores, Mara found herself thinking about his words long into the night. There was a quiet wisdom to Jacob Remington, a steadiness that came from someone who'd weathered his own storms and come through stronger for it. She was beginning to understand why Thomas trusted him with so much responsibility, why the ranch hands respected him, why Catherine had been so certain he'd help when Mrs. Chen sent word that Mara had left town. The days fell into a rhythm. Mara managed the household with growing confidence, her efficiency improving as she learned the patterns and preferences of the family. Thomas was courteous but distant, a man who spent most of his waking hours managing the ranch operations. Jacob was different, making time to check on Mara daily, often staying to help with tasks that were easier with two sets of hands. They talked during those shared moments, conversations that ranged from trivial to profound. Jacob told her about growing up in Texas, about the cattle drive that had brought him and Thomas to California 5 years ago, about the dream of building something lasting in this wild territory. Mara found herself sharing stories about her childhood in Missouri, about her parents' quiet strength, about her love of reading, and her secret dream of one day opening a school. "Why secret?" Jacob asked one afternoon, as they worked together in the vegetable garden, pulling weeds and harvesting ripe produce. Mara shrugged, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of admitting dreams that seemed impossibly distant. "Because dreams are dangerous. They make you hope for things that might never happen, and then you're just disappointed when reality doesn't measure up. Or," Jacob countered, "they give you something to work toward, a reason to keep pushing even when things are hard. Is that what the ranch is for you? A dream?" "Part of one, maybe." He pulled a particularly stubborn weed, dirt clinging to the roots. "Thomas's dream is building the biggest, most successful ranch in the valley. Mine's a bit different." "What is it?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling in the earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I want a home, not just a place to sleep or work, but somewhere that feels permanent, where I can put down roots and know they'll hold." He glanced at her, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. "Probably sounds simple compared to grand ambitions." "No," Mara said softly. "It sounds perfect." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared longing that neither had fully articulated before. They finished the gardening in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes from understanding rather than absence of words. Catherine returned 2 weeks later, her mother recovered, and in good hands with Catherine's sister. She was effusive in her praise of how well Mara had managed everything, clearly impressed by the smooth operation of the household in her absence. But Mara noticed Catherine's sharp gaze flickering between her and Jacob during meals, a knowing look that suggested the other woman had picked up on the growing connection between them. "Jacob's a good man," Catherine said one morning as she and Mara worked together preparing preserves from the garden harvest. "Steady, honest, hard-working. The kind of man you can depend on when things get difficult." Mara kept her eyes on the jars she was filling, aware of the subtext beneath Catherine's casual words. "He's been very helpful. He's been attentive," Catherine corrected gently. "In a way I haven't seen from him before. Jacob keeps most people at a distance, friendly but not close. But with you, it's different." "I don't know what you mean." Catherine laughed. Yes you do. But that's all right. Some things need time to develop naturally. She paused, her expression growing more serious. I just want you to know that if something were to develop between you two, Thomas and I would be happy about it. Jacob deserves someone who sees him for who he really is, not just what he can provide. The conversation left Mara flustered and thoughtful, forced to acknowledge feelings she'd been carefully not examining. She was attracted to Jacob, that much was undeniable, but more than that, she genuinely liked him, enjoyed his company, looked forward to their conversations. He made her feel seen and valued in a way she'd never experienced before, as though her thoughts and opinions mattered, as though she was someone worth knowing rather than simply someone to be managed or tolerated. But Mara had learned to be cautious with her heart. Attraction and affection were all well and good, but they didn't necessarily translate into anything lasting or real. She'd watched her aunt settle for Herbert Finch out of necessity rather than love, had seen too many women trapped in situations that left them voiceless and powerless. The idea of opening herself up to that kind of vulnerability terrified her, no matter how much she might want to trust in Jacob's apparent sincerity. The situation came to a head on a hot August afternoon. Mara was hanging laundry behind the main house when she heard shouting from the direction of the barn. She hurried over to find Thomas and several ranch hands gathered around one of the corrals, their attention focused on something Mara couldn't immediately see. "What happened?" she asked Charlie, who stood at the edge of the group. "Horse through Jacob," Charlie said, his young face tight with worry. "Landed hard. Doc Morrison's been sent for." Mara's heart dropped into her stomach. She pushed through the gathered men to find Jacob sitting on the ground, his back against the corral fence, his face pale and drawn with pain. Thomas knelt beside him, and even from a distance, Mara could see the unnatural angle of Jacob's left arm. She didn't remember crossing the space between them, didn't remember kneeling in the dust beside Jacob. All she knew was that suddenly she was there, her hand reaching for his good one, her voice steadier than she felt. "How bad is it?" "Broken arm," Jacob said through gritted teeth. "Maybe some cracked ribs. Could be worse." "Could be better," Thomas muttered. He looked at Mara, and she saw real fear in his eyes. Jacob wasn't just his foreman, she realized. He was his brother in every way that mattered. Doc should be here soon. Mara stayed where she was, holding Jacob's hand as they waited. She was dimly aware of the ranch hands dispersing, of Thomas giving orders, of Catherine arriving with blankets and water. But mostly she was aware of Jacob, of the way his fingers gripped hers, of the pain etched into his features, of the vulnerability of seeing this strong, capable man reduced to injury and helplessness. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, a no-nonsense man in his 50s who'd been practicing medicine on the frontier for decades. He examined Jacob with practiced efficiency, confirmed Thomas's assessment of broken arm and cracked ribs, and oversaw the painful process of setting the bone and binding Jacob's torso to protect the ribs. "You'll be useless for at least 6 weeks, Doc Morrison said bluntly. "No riding, no heavy lifting, no work that puts strain on that arm or your ribs. You need rest and time to heal, or you'll do permanent damage." Jacob looked like he wanted to argue, but one glance at Thomas's expression apparently convinced him otherwise. They got him to his feet carefully, and Mara found herself supporting his right side as they slowly made their way toward the main house. "The cabin," Jacob said. "I should go to my cabin." "You're staying in the guest room here," Catherine said firmly. "You need someone checking on you, and you're in no condition to be on your own. Mara's in the guest cabin. Then she'll stay here too, in the upstairs bedroom." Catherine's tone brooked no argument. It makes more sense anyway, given how much time she spends in the main house. They settled Jacob in the downstairs guest room, a comfortable space with a large bed and windows that overlooked the oak grove. Mara helped Catherine get him settled, fetching water and the laudanum Doc Morrison had left for pain, adjusting pillows until Jacob was as comfortable as possible given his injuries. When Catherine finally left to see to other matters, Mara remained, sitting in the chair beside the bed. Jacob's eyes were half closed, the laudanum beginning to take effect, but he seemed aware of her presence. "You don't have to stay," he murmured. "I know. Mara." He opened his eyes fully, the blue of them slightly glazed with pain and medication, but still focused on her. "Thank you for being there. Where else would I be?" The words came out more intense than she'd intended, revealing more than she'd meant to show. A slow smile curved Jacob's lips. Where else, indeed? He drifted off then, the laudanum pulling him under, and Mara sat watching him in the afternoon light filtering through the windows. Her heart felt too large for her chest, full of feelings she'd been trying so hard to deny. Seeing Jacob hurt had stripped away all her careful defenses, forced her to acknowledge that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped thinking of him as merely helpful or kind or even attractive. She cared about him, deeply and genuinely, in a way that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The next 6 weeks were an exercise in forced proximity and growing intimacy. Jacob proved to be a terrible patient, restless and frustrated by his limitations, prone to trying to do things he had no business attempting. Mara found herself in the role of both caretaker and enforcer, bringing him meals, changing his bandages, and physically preventing him from leaving the room when he got stubborn about wanting to check on ranch operations. "I'm going to lose my mind," Jacob complained one afternoon in the second week, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a caged animal. "Thomas is out there managing everything alone, and I'm stuck in here useless." "You're healing," Mara said firmly, setting down the lunch tray she'd brought. "Which is the opposite of useless. Thomas has been running ranches since before you were born. He can manage for a few weeks. He needs help. He has help. He has the hands. He has Pete. He has Catherine managing logistics. And he has me passing along messages and running interference when needed." She sat in her usual chair, picking up the book she'd been reading aloud to Jacob to pass the time. "Now, shall we continue with Mr. Dickens, or would you prefer to sulk some more?" Jacob laughed despite himself, the sound ending in a wince as his ribs protested. "You're merciless. I'm practical. There's a difference." They'd fallen into a routine, these daily sessions where Mara read aloud, while Jacob listened or dozed or simply enjoyed the company. They'd worked their way through 2 novels already, with Jacob offering commentary and questions that sparked discussions ranging from literature to philosophy to their personal beliefs about everything from religion to politics. Mara had never had conversations like this before, had never known the pleasure of matching wits with someone who challenged her intellectually while respecting her opinions. Jacob treated her thoughts as valuable, worth considering and debating, and it was intoxicating in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jacob said one evening as the sun set outside his window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. Mara set aside her book, meeting his gaze. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." He shifted carefully, trying to get more comfortable without jarring his injuries. "Why do you keep everyone at arm's length? Even Catherine, who's been nothing but kind to you, even me most of the time." The question was more perceptive than Mara had expected, cutting right to the heart of defenses she'd maintained since arriving in California. "Because distance is safer," she said finally. "If you don't let people close, they can't hurt you when they leave, or when circumstances change, or when they decide you're not worth the effort anymore. That's a lonely way to live. It's a practical way to survive." Jacob was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful in the fading light. "Is it, though? Surviving isn't the same as living, Mara. I learned that after my parents died. I spent 2 years just going through the motions, keeping everyone at a distance because I was afraid of losing anyone else I cared about. And you know what I discovered? The loneliness was worse than the risk of loss. At least when you let people in, you have something real, even if it's temporary. And when it ends, when they leave or die or simply stop caring, then you grieve and you remember, and eventually you find the courage to try again." He held her gaze steadily. "But you also have the memories of what it felt like to be connected to someone, to matter to them and have them matter to you. That's worth the risk, Mara. At least I think it is." Mara felt tears pricking at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple at all. It's probably the hardest thing anyone ever does, opening themselves up to another person." Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "But I think you're brave enough to do it. You've already survived more hardship than most people face in a lifetime. Letting yourself care about someone, that's just a different kind of courage." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meanings and possibility. Mara wanted to argue, wanted to maintain her careful distance, but she was so tired of being alone, so weary of protecting a heart that ached from isolation as much as from loss. "What if I'm not as brave as you think?" she whispered. "Then I guess I'll just have to be patient while you figure out that you are." Jacob smiled, the expression so full of warmth and understanding that Mara felt something crack in her chest, a fissure in the walls she'd built so carefully. She didn't say anything more that night, but something had shifted fundamentally between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since that first day on the dusty road outside Chico. Mara went to sleep in her new room upstairs, with her heart pounding and her mind racing, equal parts terrified and hopeful about what morning might bring. The next few weeks saw the relationship between Mara and Jacob deepen in ways both subtle and profound. They continued their daily routines, but now there was an undercurrent of awareness, of possibility, that colored every interaction. Jacob grew bolder in his affection, complimenting Mara's cooking or the way the light caught her hair, thanking her for her care with an intensity that went beyond simple gratitude. And Mara, slowly but surely, let herself respond, smiling more freely, touching his hand when she adjusted his pillows, staying longer than strictly necessary simply because she enjoyed his company. Catherine noticed, of course, and said nothing, though her knowing smile spoke volumes. Thomas, less observant about interpersonal dynamics, remained focused on keeping the ranch running smoothly in Jacob's absence. But even he commented one evening at dinner that Jacob seemed to be healing faster than expected, his spirits remarkably good for someone forced into inactivity. "That's because he has good care," Catherine said, her gaze flickering meaningfully to Mara. By the 6th week, Doc Morrison pronounced Jacob well enough to begin light activities, with strict warnings about not overdoing it. The relief of being mobile again did wonders for Jacob's mood, though Mara noticed he still sought her out constantly, finding excuses to be near her as he slowly resumed his duties. It came to a head on a September evening, the air finally cooling from summer's heat into the pleasant warmth of early autumn. Mara was in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner when Jacob appeared in the doorway, his expression nervous in a way she'd never seen before. "Want to take a walk?" he asked. "The moon's rising and it's nice out." Mara dried her hands, her pulse quickening. "All right." They walked in silence toward the oak grove, the path illuminated by moonlight and the distant glow of lamps from the main house. When they reached the clearing where Mara's cabin stood, Jacob stopped, turning to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I'm afraid if I don't do it now, I'll lose my nerve." Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it?" "I'm in love with you." The words came out in a rush, unpolished but utterly sincere. "I think I have been since that first day I found you on the road, determined and stubborn and so fierce in your independence. These past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, it's only made me more certain. You're smart and kind and brave, and you make me want to be better than I am. I know I'm just a ranch foreman with no prospects beyond what I earn here, and you deserve so much more. But I had to tell you, I couldn't keep it inside anymore." Mara stared at him, her mind reeling. Part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from the vulnerability of this moment. But a larger part, the part that had been slowly unfurling over the past months, yearned to meet his honesty with her own. "You're not just a ranch foreman," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're the man who saw me at my lowest and offered help without judgment. You're the person who makes me laugh and challenges me and treats me like I matter. You're Jacob, and that's everything." Mara, her name on his lips was half prayer, half question. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Terrified, actually. Because caring about you means risking loss again, and I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You are." Jacob stepped closer, close enough that Mara could feel the warmth radiating from him. "And you don't have to be strong alone. That's what love is, isn't it? Sharing the burden so neither person has to carry it all. Is that what this is? Love?" "I think so." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he cupped her face gently with his right hand, the left still bound though healing. "But you tell me, what do you feel?" Mara closed her eyes, letting herself truly examine the emotions she'd been dancing around for weeks. She felt safe with Jacob, valued and understood in ways she'd never experienced. She thought about him constantly, looked forward to seeing him, felt more alive and present when he was near. The thought of him leaving, of losing him, created an ache in her chest that felt insurmountable. "I think I love you too," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "And it terrifies me." Jacob's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Then we'll be terrified together." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, a question and an answer all at once. Mara kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat rapid and strong beneath her palms. It was her first kiss, though she'd never admit that aloud, and it was everything she'd secretly dreamed kisses might be, tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly, give you time to be sure. I know we've only known each other a few months, but Mara, I want a future with you. Marriage, a home, everything." "That's a lot to promise," Mara said, but her heart soared at the words. "Only if you want it too. If you need time, if you want to wait, I'll respect that. But I needed you to know where I stand, what I'm hoping for." Mara pulled back enough to look at him properly. This man who'd inserted himself into her life and refused to let her face the world alone. "I want it," she said firmly. "Maybe I'm crazy, maybe it's too fast, but I want all of it, with you." The joy on Jacob's face was almost painful in its intensity. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Mara let herself fall into it, into the promise and the possibility of a future she'd stopped believing in. They stayed in the grove for hours, talking and planning and stealing kisses in the moonlight. Jacob spoke of building them a house on ranch land with Thomas's blessing. Mara shared her dream of opening a school, and Jacob immediately began strategizing how they might make it happen, perhaps starting with teaching ranch children in their spare time. They talked about everything and nothing, mapping out a life together with the enthusiasm of people discovering they wanted the same things. When they finally returned to the main house, hand in hand, Catherine was waiting on the porch with a smile that suggested she'd known exactly where things were heading. "I suppose I should start planning a wedding," she said cheerfully. "If you're willing," Jacob said, grinning, "but nothing too fancy. Something simple, just family and friends." "Simple I can do." Catherine came forward and hugged Mara warmly. "Welcome to the family, truly this time." The next months passed in a blur of happiness and preparation. Jacob and Mara courted with all the propriety expected in their community, though everyone who saw them together could tell they were deeply in love. Jacob was attentive and romantic in ways that made Mara's heart flutter, bringing her wildflowers from the fields, carving her a beautiful jewelry box during the long evenings, writing her letters even though they lived on the same property simply because he wanted to express feelings that were easier on paper. Mara blossomed under the attention and the security of knowing she was loved. She threw herself into her work with renewed energy, taking pride in creating a home, not just for the Remington family, but for herself and Jacob. She spent her free time planning their future, corresponding with her aunt, who was delighted by the engagement news, and slowly building friendships in the community now that she felt she belonged somewhere. They married in November, a small ceremony at the Chico church with the Remingtons, Mara's Aunt Sarah and her new husband, Mrs. Chen, Doc Morrison, and various ranch hands and townspeople in attendance. Mara wore a simple dress of ivory silk that Catherine had helped her sew, and Jacob wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous and so full of love that Mara felt tears streaming down her face before she even reached the altar. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, and Mara barely heard the rest, too focused on Jacob's face, on the way his eyes never left hers, on the steady pressure of his hands holding hers as they exchanged vows. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with such enthusiasm that the assembled guests laughed and applauded. Mara kissed him back, no longer afraid of vulnerability, no longer worried about loss. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed half the county. There was music and dancing, with Jacob sweeping Mara into a waltz despite his still healing ribs, both of them laughing as they moved together under the stars. "Happy?" Jacob asked, his voice low and intimate. "Deliriously," Mara replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. They spent their wedding night in a new cabin Jacob had built with Thomas's help, larger than the guest cabin and situated on a rise that overlooked the ranch. It was their home, truly theirs, and Mara felt the significance of the moment as Jacob carried her over the threshold, both of them giddy with love and the promise of their life together. Their marriage was everything Mara had never dared dream of, a partnership built on respect and affection and genuine friendship. They worked together, laughed together, built their life with care and intention. Jacob proved to be a devoted husband, attentive to Mara's needs and generous with his affection. Mara, in turn, found herself opening more fully than she ever had, trusting in Jacob's love enough to show him all her fears and hopes and dreams. A year into their marriage, Mara discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and not a little terror, the weight of impending parenthood suddenly very real. Jacob became even more protective, though Mara had to remind him repeatedly that pregnancy was not an illness and she was perfectly capable of continuing her work. Their son was born in July of 1880, a healthy baby boy with Jacob's dark hair and Mara's green eyes. They named him Daniel Thomas Remington, honoring both their families, and Mara had never experienced love like what she felt the first time she held her son, with Jacob's arm around her shoulders and tears streaming down his face. Parenthood transformed them in ways both challenging and beautiful. Jacob proved to be a natural father, patient and playful, equally comfortable changing diapers as teaching Daniel to ride when he was old enough. Mara discovered reserves of strength and love she hadn't known she possessed, the fierce protectiveness of a mother combined with the joy of watching her child grow. As Daniel grew, Mara finally pursued her dream of teaching, starting with a few ranch children in their cabin before the demand grew enough that the community helped build a small schoolhouse in Chico. Jacob supported her fully, often bringing Daniel to visit during the day, proud of his wife's accomplishment in bringing education to children who might otherwise have had none. 2 years after Daniel, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose, who had Mara's delicate features and Jacob's sunny disposition. And 3 years after that, another son, Michael James, who seemed determined to keep his parents on their toes with his adventurous spirit from the moment he could walk. Life was full and rich and occasionally overwhelming, but it was theirs. Mara looked back sometimes on that day she'd tried to walk out of Chico alone, desperate and afraid, and marveled at how completely her life had changed. Jacob had been right. Letting people in, taking the risk of love, was worth every moment of fear and vulnerability. They built a larger house eventually, as their family grew, and Jacob's position evolved from foreman to partner when Thomas brought him into the ranch ownership. The Double Creek prospered under their combined management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the Sacramento Valley. But for Mara and Jacob, success was measured less in cattle and land than in the life they had created together. Children who knew they were loved, a home filled with laughter and warmth, and a love that deepened with each passing year. Mara still taught, though less frequently as the demands of 3 active children grew. Jacob still worked the ranch, though he made sure to prioritize time with his family, never wanting his children to feel second to his work. They built traditions. Sunday dinners with Thomas and Catherine and their growing family. Summer picnics by the creek. Winter evenings gathered around the fireplace with Jacob reading aloud while Mara sewed and the children played. There were hard times too, of course. A drought year that threatened the ranch's survival. Illness that struck too close to home. The normal struggles of raising children and maintaining a marriage through life's inevitable challenges. But they faced it all together. The partnership they had forged in those early months proving strong enough to weather whatever storms came their way. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Mara with a trip, just the two of them, leaving the children with Catherine and Thomas for a long weekend. They traveled to San Francisco, staying in a proper hotel and dining in restaurants and generally behaving like the young lovers they'd been a decade earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked one evening as they walked along the waterfront, the sunset painting the bay in shades of purple and gold. "Staying in Chico instead of striking out for Sacramento like you'd planned?" Mara leaned into him, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice. "Never, not even for a moment." She looked up at him, this man who'd changed the entire trajectory of her life. "You saved me that day, you know, not just from dying in the desert, but from a life of always running, always being alone. You taught me it was safe to stop, to trust, to love." "We saved each other," Jacob said, kissing the top of her head. "I was going through the motions before you came along. You gave me purpose beyond work, reminded me what I was building toward." "A home," Mara said softly, remembering that conversation in the garden so many years ago. "The best home I could have imagined." Jacob pulled her closer, and they stood watching the sun disappear below the horizon, content in the silence of shared understanding. They returned to Chico rejuvenated, ready to dive back into the beautiful chaos of their life. Daniel was 7 now, already showing signs of the same steady reliability that characterized his father. Elizabeth was 5, creative and curious, constantly asking questions that challenged Mara to explain the world in ways a child could understand. And Michael was 2, a bundle of energy who kept everyone on their toes. As the years continued to pass, Mara and Jacob watched their children grow, with the pride and occasional panic of all parents. Daniel proved to be a natural with horses and cattle, spending every spare moment learning the ranch business from his father and uncle. Elizabeth developed a love of books that rivaled her mother's, and Mara began teaching her daughter herself, recognizing a keen intelligence that deserved nurturing. Michael remained their wild child, climbing everything, exploring constantly, keeping them all young with his inexhaustible enthusiasm. The school Mara had founded grew, eventually employing 2 other teachers and educating children from all over the county. It became a source of community pride, and Mara's role in its creation earned her respect that went far beyond her position as Jacob Remington's wife. She was her own person, valued for her mind and her contributions, and Jacob never let her forget how proud he was of everything she'd accomplished. They added 1 more child to their family when Mara was 32, a surprise daughter they named Sarah Catherine, after both their mothers, the aunt who'd brought Mara west, and the sister-in-law who'd become her closest friend. Sarah was a gentle soul, quiet and observant, content to spend hours drawing or watching the world around her with thoughtful attention. By the time their 20th anniversary approached, Mara and Jacob had built a life that exceeded every dream they'd ever articulated to each other. Their marriage remained strong, weathered by time, into something deeper and more resilient than the passionate romance of their youth. They still made time for each other, still sought out moments of privacy and connection, still looked at each other with love and appreciation. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Mara asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and amber. The children were inside, the older ones helping with dinner while Sarah played quietly with her dolls. "When I was walking out of town," Jacob smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with memory and affection. "I said not alone again." "You did." Mara reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "And you kept that promise. I haven't been alone a single day since." "Neither have I." Jacob brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Best decision I ever made, riding after you that day." "Best decision I ever made was listening when you caught up." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared and the first stars emerged, the sounds of their children drifting through the open windows behind them. This was home, Mara thought. Not just the house or the land, but this, Jacob's hand in hers, their family safe and happy. The knowledge that she was loved and valued and belonged somewhere completely. The years ahead would bring their own challenges and joys. They would watch their children grow into adults, navigate the complexities of teenagers with varying degrees of success and humor, eventually welcome grandchildren who would carry their legacy forward. Daniel would take over much of the ranch management, working alongside his father with the same partnership that Jacob and Thomas had modeled. Elizabeth would become a teacher herself, taking over Mara's school when Mara was ready to step back. Michael would surprise everyone by developing a talent for business, helping expand the ranch's operations into new territories. And Sarah would marry young to a kind man who appreciated her quiet strength, building her own happy family nearby. Through it all, Mara and Jacob remained the foundation, their love the bedrock upon which their family was built. They grew old together gracefully, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing, but their connection remaining as strong as ever. They never took for granted the life they'd created, always aware of how easily things could have gone differently if Jacob hadn't ridden after Mara that summer day in 1878. On their 50th anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends who'd become family over the decades, Jacob stood to make a toast. His hand shook slightly as he raised his glass, but his voice was strong and clear. 50 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I refused to let the woman I loved walk away alone. Mara, you've been my partner, my best friend, my home in every sense that matters. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for building this incredible life with me. Thank you for every single day we've shared." Mara stood, her own eyes bright with tears, and kissed him to the applause and cheers of their assembled family. "Thank you for not letting me be alone again," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for everything." The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually Mara and Jacob slipped away to the porch of their home, the same spot where they'd spent countless evenings over the years. They sat together watching the stars, Jacob's arm around Mara's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, the question he'd posed so many times over the years. "Not a single one," Mara replied, the answer she always gave. "You? Just that I can't live this life all over again." He kissed the top of her head. "But I'd choose you every time, in every version of forever." They sat together under the stars, two people who'd found each other against the odds and built something lasting and true. The Wild West that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when Mara first arrived had become home. Not because the land had changed, but because she'd found her place in it. She'd found love, family, purpose, and belonging, all because one cowboy had refused to let her face the world alone. As they finally rose to go inside, Jacob took her hand, and they walked together into the warmth of their home, into the life they'd created, into the future that still held promise and joy. The door closed behind them, but through the windows, anyone passing could see the lights blazing warm and welcoming, a testament to a love that had transformed two lonely people into a family that would endure for generations. And in the end, that was everything Mara had never dared to dream possible. A love story that started with 3 words, "Not alone again," and grew into a lifetime of togetherness, happiness, and home.